He went down in history as the man who created the atomic bomb. But few people know what price he paid for this victory. Betrayal, loneliness, guilt, and fear. This is not just a biography. It is the story of a man who changed the world and then became his own victim. Robert Oppenheimer was born in 1904 into a wealthy family in New York City. Already from childhood, he was not like everyone else. He did not play with other children, did not race a ball in the yard. Instead, he read a lot. By the age of 10, he knew more than many adults. Teachers marveled at his memory. But there was another side to this genius. Robert suffered from severe depression from a young age. He could remain silent for weeks, avoided people, and hardly ate. In one such attack, he tried to poison his teacher by slipping him chemicals. The teacher was rescued, but the case was hushed up because of his wealthy family. Later, Oppenheimer himself said, "I didn't know how to handle myself." But instead of breaking down, he went deeper into science, and not just physics. He studied Sanskrit, the ancient Indian language in which philosophical and religious texts are written. For the sake of science, he learned it himself, so he could read the Bhagavad Gita without translation. In this text, he sought answers to his questions. What is good and evil? Why does man destroy? And does a scholar have the right to create a force that can destroy everything? While his peers were getting jobs at banks or getting married, he spent hours in the lab writing formulas. At 30, he became a professor at UCLA. He was surrounded by students as smart and obsessed as he was. Everyone sensed this man thought differently. He understood how atoms work, but even more profoundly, how human nature works. But here's the question. How did he go from a depressed boy with poison in his pocket to the man who detonated the world's first atomic bomb? They called it the Manhattan Project, but it had nothing to do with New York City. It was the most secret and most dangerous project in human history. Its goal was to create the world's first weapon capable of destroying cities in seconds. And it was led by a man who spent his life searching for the truth, Robert Oppenheimer. America feared the Nazis would build the atomic bomb first. It could change the course of the Second World War. In 1942, the race was on, a race to survive. In the deserts of New Mexico, behind barbed wire, hundreds of the world's best scientists were gathered. They weren't brought there for fame or money. They worked day and night, often not knowing exactly what the neighbor in the next room was doing. Everything was classified. Oppenheimer became the scientific director. He was chosen not for his rank, but for his intelligence and charisma. He could talk to scientists, understand generals, and still keep everything in his head. He lived the idea. He believed that if he could create a weapon so powerful, no one would ever dare to go to war again. Those who were around him remembered. He walked around the camp like a man on whom the whole world hangs, and in a way it was true. The project cost more than $2 billion and employed nearly 130,000 people. Oppenheimer assembled a team of real stars of science: Enrico Fermi, Niels Bohr, Richard Feynman. Conditions were harsh: absolute secrecy, high pressure, lack of sleep and rest. But there were also tragedies. During one of the experiments, scientist Harry Daghlian was accidentally irradiated when he dropped a block of uranium and caused an uncontrollable chain reaction. He lived 25 agonizing days and died in terrible pain. He was called the first victim of the atomic age. There were more stories like this than are officially recognized. And then came the day of the test. July 16, 1945. A morning in the desert. Total silence, everyone in the bunker. Oppenheimer looks toward the explosion. A moment later, the brightest flash, a rumble, the sky turns orange. The earth shakes, and so the atomic bomb is born. At that moment, he quietly recited the words of the ancient Bhagavad Gita, "Now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." It was then that he realized they had crossed the line. It cannot be undone. When the smoke cleared after the first explosion of the atomic bomb, Robert Oppenheimer became a real star. Newspapers wrote about him as the man who had helped America win. President Truman called him a national treasure, and scientists called him a symbol of scientific triumph. But how did Oppenheimer himself feel? He didn't rejoice. He saw how in Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed more than 200,000 people, most of them civilians. He knew this was not just a victory. This is the point of no return. A few months after the bombings, he went to the White House. He wanted to talk to the president. He brought with him only one thought: we must not make more bombs. We must stop. Truman listened to him, but he didn't support him. And when Oppenheimer left, the president threw a phrase to his aides: "Don't let that sentimental fool in here anymore." So one of the most respected scientists in the country became a dangerous dreamer in the eyes of the government. Oppenheimer began to oppose the creation of the hydrogen bomb, an even more powerful weapon. He said, "We didn't just create weapons, we created fear, and now we're living in it." But at the height of the Cold War, such words sounded like treason. Suspicion began. They started checking him out. They remembered that in the 30s he was friends with people who had once been associated with the communists. They started looking for dirt, questioning his colleagues, digging into his personal life. In 1954, closed hearings began, similar to a trial. The authorities accused him of being unreliable. The reason? Old acquaintances with people suspected of sympathizing with communism. The real reason was that he went against the system and started saying that America should not continue the nuclear race. The hearings were show trials. He was called in for questioning, forced to justify every word he said, every letter he wrote, every person he knew. And here was the scariest moment. His friends, those with whom he had built the bomb, with whom he had lived and worked, were silent. They were afraid for themselves, afraid of losing their careers. One by one, they turned their backs on him. This wasn't just a trial, it was a public humiliation. He was stripped of his security clearance and thus cut off from the science from which he had never strayed. He could no longer participate in major projects, could no longer teach at the best universities. No respected scientific organization wanted him. Oppenheimer was left alone. He went to an island in the Atlantic and lived there with his family, smoking a lot, reading, looking at the ocean. He wrote philosophical articles, but he was never called anywhere else. He, the creator of the atomic bomb, couldn't even get a job as a physics consultant. The man who had recently been hailed as a genius and a hero had been turned away by almost everyone. The newspapers were silent. Colleagues didn't stand up for him. He became a stranger in the country for which he had created the most terrible weapon in history. But today, Robert Oppenheimer's name is back in the public eye. Movies are being made about him, books are being written, arguments are being made on the internet. But what should we really remember about him? The brilliant scientist who gave the world the atomic age, or the man who was first glorified and then destroyed by that same era? Oppenheimer lived a complicated life. He was a physicist, a philosopher, a leader, a loner. He became a symbol of scientific progress and at the same time a symbol of moral tragedy. For the rest of his life, he struggled with guilt. He could no longer look at the fire. He said the flames reminded him of that first explosion, after which everything changed. After all he had done, after he had effectively caused the end of World War II, he was written out of history. For almost half a century, no awards, no recognition. It wasn't until 2022, 60 years after his death, that the US government officially recognized that he had been treated unjustly. That decision changed nothing. He died in 1967, quietly, almost forgotten. So who was Oppenheimer, a hero or a destroyer? The answer is not so simple. He was a living man with pain, doubts, fears, and genius. His story is not just about science, it's about choices, the price of progress, and how easily a man can be unnecessary, even if he changed the whole world. What do you think about it? Write in the comments.